I don't have a PowerPoint, so you're just going to have to look at my wonderful face for the next 10 minutes. Just by means of an introduction, my name is Alexa Moore. I'm a director of Transgender NI, which is a human rights organisation based in Northern Ireland. We run the Belfast Trans Resource Centre that Christopher is going to talk to you about in a minute, which is the only dedicated trans community space in the whole of the UK and Ireland. It's a pretty big deal. And yeah, no, I'm kind of just here to talk about my involvement in abortion rights activism, north and south of the border. A little bit of background on myself. I'm from the kind of border regions of Ireland. My mum's side of the family is from the north and my dad's side of the family is from the south. So I was a border hopper for a kind of significant part of my childhood. And as a result, I had the pleasure to be quite deeply involved in abortion rights activism south of the border and also north as well. And I'll talk about repeal first of all, because it was the kind of the first thing that came round, and it was kind of the first thing that got me involved anyway. What came before repeal was years of dedicated activism from feminist movements, from LGBT movements, and in particular from an organisation called the Abortion Rights Campaign in Ireland, who took an explicitly trans-inclusive line on abortion access. Their language has consistently been trans-inclusive, and they talk about pregnant persons and make sure to kind of analyse any barriers to access for trans men and non-binary people who require abortions. When the referendum happened, to an extent that was lost. There was this movement, there was this push within the repeal campaign, and also outside the repeal campaign there was massive pressure on that campaign to capitulate and to, quote-unquote, appeal to Middle Ireland, as though Middle Ireland doesn't also have trans people, or LGBT people, or people who recognise and respect the identities of trans and LGBT people, because Middle Ireland is just ignorant and backwards, and they're all super religious and all of that nonsense. So that was the line that was taken there, and as a result, a lot of people during the repeal campaign felt incredibly excluded. I'm just going to push this in to give me a bit more space to move around. They felt incredibly excluded because they weren't being recognised in the language, and it wasn't just trans people, migrants, asylum seekers and refugees. You know, while Savita was a pretty big case in terms of someone who died because she wasn't given access to abortion, and she was also a migrant. Migrant issues and refugee and asylum seeker issues were not really talked about during the campaign. As a result, I would argue, as a direct result, this need to appeal to Middle Ireland and this kind of move away from kind of the radical activism that had been done for years before resulted in a law that just does not work. It doesn't work for people. There's a 12-week limit on access to abortion, and after that it's in cases where there's danger to the woman's health. The bill itself is explicitly trans-exclusionary. There is no mention of access for trans people, which is interesting because that kind of flies in the face of Ireland's gender recognition law, which is based on self-identification. And so you have that kind of paradox that was mentioned previously, where trans men and some non-binary people who have legally changed their gender to male could be denied access to abortion care. What we've seen also is people in direct provision and refugees and asylum seekers being denied access to abortion, being denied access to kind of healthcare services more broadly. And I would argue that that is the kind of, maybe not a direct result, and there is a lot of factors that go into the creating of this bill, and I think we have to remember that despite the fact that we have a gay Taoiseach, which is kind of the Irish version of a prime minister or whatever, there's still a heavily right-wing party, and they still fought tooth and nail against abortion decriminalisation. And so there's a lot of kind of factors there that played into it, which resulted in, essentially, marginalised groups being left behind in this abortion law. And kind of coming from that and looking northwards, I think a lot of people saw the repeal campaign and saw the mistakes that the campaign made, and kind of decided, okay, we're not going to capitulate, we're not going to exclude folks, we're going to make this campaign as intersectional and as kind of as inclusive as possible. And so, you know, they did, and there's a marked difference between the abortion rights activism in Northern Ireland between 2016 and 2020. In terms of trans inclusion, in terms of the kind of inclusion of all marginalised identities, and part of that is because in Northern Ireland, oh goodness, got too close there. In Northern Ireland, there's a very strong evangelical Christian presence. There's a very strong evangelical right-wing presence, and I think that maybe isn't as much the case anymore in Britain. So what you see in Northern Ireland is feminist movements, trans movements, LGBT movements, banding together essentially against this kind of evangelical right presence that has its grip on the power of Stormont, on the power of the state more broadly. And I think that's why we saw just a lot less kind of transphobic activity within feminist movements and a lot less trans exclusion, because essentially we recognised who the real enemies were. We recognised, you know, where our energy needed to go rather than infighting. We united on the issue of reproductive justice and abortion access. We united on that and pushed to make sure that our law in the north of Ireland was not the same as the one in the south, or wasn't even close. That one in the south, just kind of to reiterate, criminalises access to abortion outside of the provision of the Act. So if for instance, you help someone access an abortion in the Republic of Ireland, you could be prosecuted. If it's outside the provisions that have already been outlined by the government, if it's outside what they have told you is okay to do with your body. And I think one of the major lessons learned in the north, and I think it's something that has been advocated for a long time, but it's even more pertinent now, is full decriminalisation. We asked for full decriminalisation and nothing less. And to that end, we got CEDAW recommendations, the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Those recommendations were put into law and implemented in Northern Ireland as of the 22nd of October. CEDAW has never really been applied in that way, and obviously it is a kind of, it's explicitly eliminating discrimination against women, so there's still a bit of work to do there in terms of ensuring that that process was trans-inclusive. And unfortunately, the UK government and the Northern Ireland office weren't exactly doing that work proactively, I'll tell you that much. There's a thing in Northern Ireland called Section 75, and I don't want to get bogged down because I'm being told that I have 1 minute. Section 75 essentially commits all public authorities to promoting equality amongst different groups, equality on gender, on sexuality, on race, and on kind of age, on rurality, and so on and so forth. And so they screened this abortion policy that they were doing, which used incredibly trans-exclusionary language, which imposed term limits, which you know, the kind of questions that they were asking were kind of designed to trip activists up. And they did this equality screening, and the only two aspects that they could find that this would have an impact on was religious people and women. They didn't look at trans people, they didn't look at migrants, they didn't look at They didn't look at LGBT people trying to access abortions. They look at the kind of moral opposition from religious groups in Northern Ireland and the impact that it would have on women. And so there was a pretty distinct kind of opposition to that, and I think one of the biggest things that came out of that was feminist and trans groups, ourselves included, and in particular Alliance for Choice, and other kind of abortion, kind of similar to the abortion rights campaign in the North, united together and went to the Northern Ireland office and said, you know what, screw you, this isn't good enough. And I would say we gave them hell, but we kind of made sure that they recognised the kind of different issues that they had left out, and made sure that they were kind of addressing those. And just to kind of wrap up, in Britain, in kind of the rest of the UK, there is this very distinct divide between trans organisations, trans movements, trans communities and feminist communities. It doesn't have to be that way. In Northern Ireland we have done it differently. You know, we have joined together, we have united to fight for bodily autonomy, to fight for reproductive justice. And I think abortion and abortion decriminalisation is a really good place to come together and unite those communities. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kirsty McIlwaine. I'm the Community Development Officer for Gender Jam. Gender Jam is a youth charity based in Northern Ireland. We have 3 youth groups currently in Newry, Derry and Belfast. And these are just youth groups for mainly community peer support and one-to-one support for young people, trans young people aged from 12 to 25. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about well, Alexa's mentioned a good bit about the abortion law currently. So what I'm talking about is mainly the issues that trans people have faced in Northern Ireland to do with abortion rights, and a little bit about pregnancy as well, because I feel like it's quite relevant. And talk a little bit about relationships and sexual health education, and the sexual health sectors within Northern Ireland as well. And then afterwards, after all of the doom and gloom of that, talking about how the community sector in Northern Ireland has helped support each other throughout the near 3 years of the NI Assembly not being there. Thank God it's here now, but there's a lot of work still to be done. So yeah, since the 22nd of October, abortion has been decriminalised in Northern Ireland. But with the NI 6-week consultation, as Alexa said, there was a lack of consideration for trans people. And Transgender NI had given their response to this consultation. And within this consultation, it states the different issues that trans people have faced with abortion rights. Now these might be the same as a lot of trans people across the world, but these are experiences from our direct community interaction through our healthcare consultation that we had last year, through youth forums between Gender Jam and other youth groups like Our Friend, which is an LGBT youth group, and through community chats and our own one-to-one support and advocating support for trans people in Northern Ireland. So to start off with, in general, trans people trying to start a family would face a lot of obstacles. Biologically, pregnancy or an alternative route such as IVF. Pregnancy in itself would cause a lot of issues, but I'm going to talk a little bit here about IVF specifically in Northern Ireland. So it takes a 6-month period in general, not just for trans people, but in general, to try and receive IVF treatment. It takes 6 months for you to basically prove that you have been trying to conceive and to prove that you're able to start a family. So that in itself is hard, but specifically for trans and gender diverse people, it's going to be even trickier. And even with that, only about 5 people each year receive IVF. So pregnancy in general, from the consultation, some of the main experiences, these are personal experiences such as extreme gender dysphoria and mental health problems with pregnancy within itself. Considering pregnancy or non-deliberate pregnancies. but this has been seen as the most easiest option for starting a family in Northern Ireland due to all the loopholes that trans people have had to jump through for any other sort of access, and this is mainly down to the services working off the Western gender binary within itself, and because of that, the cultural competence for trans people, or in general, is inadequate at all. So the care for trans people is not there at all, and there's just complete lack of consideration for diverse bodies. So if trans people are not excluded from family support services that work off a cis and heteronormative way, then they go to self-exclusion, and this is the same for abortion as well. With family support, it is highly gendered, it is highly targeted towards cis heterosexual women. So those trans people and gender diverse people who can get pregnant, this service is basically just not unwelcoming in general. And from this, and from the social pressure of living in rural, which is backed up by the Gender Identity Clinic in Northern Ireland, this leads to, again, self-exclusion, which will lead to stuff such as backstreet abortions and buying pills online. So generally, the safety of trans people within Northern Ireland is still at risk, whether it be that or through mental health problems as well, because of these services not being supportive and complete inadequate care within itself. And going a wee bit on to pregnancy and the GIC as well. So the GIC at the moment in Northern Ireland has not seen, especially Brackenburn, which is the adult clinic, has not seen a new patient since January of 2018. So this has been 2 years now that no new patients have been through. So with that as well, with their stringent, again, working off the Western gender binary, trans people and any gender diverse people wanting to get healthcare for medical intervention, with that and through pregnancy and abortion, they just will not go together. The trans people are constantly caught in a catch-22 due to this. So let's say a trans person does end up getting into Brackenburn and is about to start hormone treatment, and they fall pregnant, but they want to keep on going with the pregnancy, or maybe they don't want to keep on with that and they want to get an abortion. There's many obstacles within that itself, because they work off a male and female sort of aspect, and men shouldn't be getting pregnant. That's the sort of way they work. This whole living in rural aspect that you have to abide by to get medical treatment, then that halts that person getting that intervention, and it halts the support as well. Most likely you'll see trans patients getting kicked off of the waiting list and thrown out into the open with no support from the GICs and even the mental health services in Northern Ireland. And then with abortion as well, since the terminal services have not been introduced yet in Northern Ireland, you still see patients travelling over to GB to get these abortions, and a lot of trans people cannot, one, afford this, and then also there's other obstacles facing that, such as in work benefits that don't allow them to travel to go and get this as well. Yeah, basically in general, excuse my friends, it's a load of bullshit. But going on to a little bit about relationships, sexual health education. So the Education Authority states that it is compulsory in Northern Ireland for every school to provide relationship sexual health education, though this is not enforced or policed. So you find a lot of schools not giving adequate relationship sexual education support for even cis and heteronormative situations. So this means that for sexual orientation and gender identity, that it's completely not compulsory at all. The Education Authority had given out guidelines for transgender students, and it had mentioned about teaching gender identity within schools. But again, this is non-statutory, so schools do not have to abide by this. It's just basically like, it would be good if you did, but we don't find schools doing this at all. So from a young age, trans people are not sure of their fertility routes, they're not even sure about sexual health in general, they're not sure about healthy relationships, they're not given any sort of guidance there whatsoever. And then with sexual health as well, this could be seen as another another quite heavily gendered clinic. So again, working off that binary. The Gun Clinic in Northern Ireland are quite accepting of trans patients, but what they lack is the cultural competence for diverse bodies. So trans masculine people can't enter the male service, and trans women can go for the female service. But the issue there is that there's no consideration of reproductive organs. So when it comes to screening, testing of any sort of kind, you have to then switch from each service and clinic, which in itself is time consuming, but also is quite can be quite a hard thing for trans people in general to have to go through both services at the same time. It's quite ridiculous. But moving on from that doom and gloom, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the community has done in the past years without an assembly. So yeah, we are based in the Belfast Trans Resource Centre, and as Alexa says, it's the only resource centre based in the UK and Ireland. And what we provide there when it comes to sexual health is we offer every month HIV and syphilis rapid testing, and this is in partnership with the Rainbow Project as well, which is fantastic to see. It means that there's a safe space for trans people to work. Just to finish off, so one thing I want to point out is we also have a trans sexual health guide for young people, if people want to have a look at that afterwards. Through our advocacy work, training and workshops and lobbying work, we have been able to reach across different services and sectors to provide, hopefully soon, adequate care. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming to this session this morning. I'm a PhD candidate with the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Before I get started, I want to respectfully acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional unceded and occupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Seychelles Coast Salish peoples. I make this acknowledgement in order to say something about my own relationship to land as the descendant of white settlers living on stolen land in Canada, which is Turtle Island. And I also make this acknowledgement to recognize the ways in which Indigenous ways of knowing and being gendered have been largely forcibly and violently erased in the name of the imposition of a Western two-sex gender binary system. And so as we're talking about trans and reproduction, recognizing that trans is not a historic or a cultural category, and that Indigenous peoples' reproductive rights have been kind of caught up in the colonial project as well. My plan for this session is threefold. I'm going to, as quickly as possible, tell you what I've been up to for the last 12 years, what brought me to this work and what I think I've accomplished. I'm going to talk through some of the major barriers to care, abortion care for trans and non-binary people in Canada, as well as some of the ways that I've been working to address those barriers. I want to recognize that Canada has had a pretty strong legal access to abortion for the last 30 years, and that kind of creates a public perception that abortion is easily and readily accessible in Canada, and that's simply not the case, even for cisgender women. So what have I been up to? My passion for this work started about 12 years ago when I was working as a clinic escort as well as in an administrative capacity at a women's only abortion clinic in a major urban center in Canada. At the time that I was hired, I was privately and secretly exploring my own gender and realized really quickly that this category of woman was no longer one that I could stretch to fit myself. Within about a year of working at the clinic, one of my colleagues, a counselor, came out as trans, indicated his intention of medical transition, of changing his name, of using he, him pronouns, and behind closed doors, the board of directors needed to figure out what to do with this employee. Ultimately, he was fired on the basis of his no longer identifying as a woman, and I was told in hushed, secret conversations that as long as I was willing to be misgendered as a woman, as long as I continued to pass as a woman, that I would be allowed to stay, and that I wouldn't, quote, transition myself out of a job. I realized really quickly that this was horribly problematic, and yet I stayed for another 2 years. During those 2 years, I started questioning the staff that worked around me. I created a really informal, without ethics review survey that I distributed to 8 of my colleagues, asking very simple questions like how many trans people have you served and how would your clinical care change if you were serving a trans person. Those 8 people who had collectively over 75 years of experience working in abortion provision told me that they had seen, to their knowledge, 2 trans people, and that beyond names and pronouns, they were unaware of how they would change or what they needed to change in their clinical practice in order to serve trans people better. I presented the results of that survey at the Canadian Professional Association for Transgender Health Conference in 2010 and was really encouraged by audience members to keep asking questions in this vein, to keep challenging and questioning and kind of creating a discourse around a conversation that simply wasn't happening. So I quit my job, came out as non-binary, changed my name, and did a master's degree focused on identifying the barriers for trans people in the abortion setting in Canada. What I did was bring together abortion providers as well as midwives working with trans people as well as trans parenting activists and put them in a room together and had them talk to one another and educate each other while I sat back and listened. Nothing really came of my master's thesis. There were some concerns over confidentiality. Abortion providers are very protective of their confidentiality for very obvious reasons. And so I kind of put this work and these ideas on the back burner, started a PhD, which is about trans people's reproductive decision-making more generally, and was still passionate about abortion, but for a number of years, this kind of project and this idea was on the back burner of my mind. Until I was approached by La Fédération du Planning de Naissance, which is the former Planned Parenthood in Quebec, and they said, we want to be trans-inclusive, we want to train our abortion providers to be trans-inclusive, we don't know how to do it, are there any resources out there that we could use? To which I said, no, but I'll write you one. So I took about a year to write the Trans-Inclusive Abortion Services Manual. They adapted it into French, so the Quebec version is available in French and English. And they were then generous enough to provide me with a small grant to adapt it for use across Canada. So it has been adapted for almost every province and territory in Canada. If you're interested in adapting it for use in your own country or translating it into another language, get in touch. I want to spread it far and wide. And if you're using this in your publications or in trainings, I often hear from people all over the world who are using it, and it just fills me with such joy to know that this passion project has become something that's being put to good use. All of the versions of it are available on my website, so if you're interested in accessing it, you can see it there. This is a kind of quick inside peek into the table of contents. A lot of the content is relevant to folks within and beyond abortion settings, including a section on how to ask questions and how to make mistakes. A section on reproductive, Mythbusters, the Trans Reproductive Edition, and then some fictionalized case scenarios that I'll talk about in just a moment. So with this manual now, with this tool, I got really great feedback from Quebec and from the trainings that they facilitated there using this as a tool. So I started using it as a tool, and I started offering myself up as someone who could help train abortion providers on how to be more transliterate and transcompetent. And so I've since done dozens of trainings. And these are not just isolated single session trainings. I also audit all policies and practices. I do clinic and facility walkthroughs where I consider the client experience from top to bottom. I audit websites. I essentially am a full service trans-inclusive abortion consultant. And so that's been something that I've been doing not only out of passion but also to pay my bills because PhDs are expensive. The National Abortion Federation, which is an American and Canadian regulatory body, caught wind of the work that I was doing. And so not only has this manual very recently been adapted for use in the United States, They also commissioned me to create an online learning manual for NAF members. That module has been available since May, and so far 190 individual abortion providers have taken this training. So, what are the major barriers to care for trans people in the abortion sector in Canada? And this is based both on my thesis and on all of the consultancy work that I've been doing in this area. The barriers tend to fall into three categories: informational erasure, institutional erasure, and political and philosophical barriers. And I'm going to go through each one in turn. Ooh, where did all the text go? All right, I've got it memorized, it's fine. So informational erasure are these knowledge gaps. One of the main things I heard in my thesis, and one of the main things I continue to hear, is people who simply are unaware that trans people need abortion services. An example from my thesis was a quality advisor who had been working in abortion care for 30 years, who simply hadn't conceptualized that trans people might need her as a service provider. She had very much internalized the public rhetoric around trans bodies, that trans folks ought to be so dysphoric in their bodies that they would never use their bodies for sexual pleasure, let alone for procreative purposes, and she couldn't imagine a world where a trans person would even need an abortion in the first place. The second informational erasure or knowledge gap is folks who ask me, have there been any systematic reviews? Any peer-reviewed scholarly articles? What about population-wide surveys so we can estimate the size and scope of this problem? Which is sometimes done as a real authentic question. People who want to know whether prolonged testosterone use has an impact on uterine perforation during D&C, people who have very medical questions that they want to turn to the literature for answers. And then other folks who simply want to use the lack of this knowledge as a way to diminish the problem and say that they ought not to even engage in the conversation of trans inclusion in the first place. There are also folks who want the competencies, but simply don't know how to do it beyond names and pronouns. And finally, there are a little bit of feedback from the trans parenting activist world that they're more interested in helping trans people become parents, and that abortion simply isn't on their radar. And so abortion is kind of siphoned off as not a parenting issue, as something else that we ought not to be talking about as we try to help people who are trans and non-binary to conceive, to adopt, to foster, that abortion is somehow separate, which I think is wrapped up in the stigma of abortion more generally. And then there's institutional erasure. So these are policies and practices, operational and logistical barriers, as well as folks who aren't even aware that trans-inclusive or trans-specific policies are even necessary in the first place. These are so numerous that we have no time to go into all of them, but these include things like branding and websites, policies around booking an appointment, security, billing, forms, language around body parts, performing physical exams, privacy and confidentiality, other clients' responses, a work climate, because trans people work in the abortion sector as well, staff training, etc., etc. They're very plentiful. And then finally, the one that I have found most challenging is political and philosophical barriers. These involve mostly women-only and women-centered spaces. So whether that's a women's-only freestanding clinic or abortion provision delivered within a women's hospital, folks who have a kind of particular political orientation to the idea of abortion, who have a difficult time seeing abortion as a trans issue. I will tell you that the abortion clinic that I worked for 12 years ago continues to have a women's-only employment policy while at the same time saying that they serve trans people, which is an employment and clinical policy at odds. And to date, they have yet to employ a single trans woman, despite a trans-inclusive women's-only policy, because they understand trans women, or the trans women that they want to employ, are passing trans women who can, quote, leave their male privilege at the door. So transphobia abounds in women's-only and women-centered abortion spaces in Canada. There's also cis-normativity and abortion rights rhetoric, activisms, and movements. So if you've ever attended an abortion rights rally and you see signs that say, no man can have an opinion about abortion, or her body, her choice, there's a kind of cis-normativity in the rhetoric and movements around abortion. And then perhaps most challenging is feminist tensions. A lot of folks in this conference have been using the language of TERFs. I much prefer farts. Feminist appropriating reactionary transphobes and that I refuse to allow trans exclusionary folks to co-opt the feminist movement for their aims. Thanks. I didn't create parts, but I love it. Ultimately, what is at stake here is the cis-normatively gendered silos of reproductive life and health. And this is comical, but this is someone's art, and I have co-opted their art for my purposes. These are silos in, I think, Wyoming. But ultimately, what is at stake is that we have siloed abortion off as a women's issue, and that has created a lot of this informational and institutional erasure, as well as the political and philosophical barriers that trans people experience in abortion care. So, what have I been doing about it? When I do trainings in person, both in, as well as the kind of content of the manual and the learning module, I use fictionalized, problem-based case scenarios. Essentially, I create a fake trans person, I put them in a situation where things go horribly awry, and I ask folks to reflect on what happened, why it happened, how the person felt because it happened, and what they would be able to do in order to make sure it doesn't happen again. For example, and as I read this through, maybe you can think through and help, in your own brain, try to identify some of the barriers. Michael stopped taking testosterone 9 months ago without physician supervision due to concerns over chronic acne. He read online that his period should have returned by now, but hasn't. He takes an at-home pregnancy test and finds out that he is unexpectedly pregnant. He turns to the internet to find information on abortion services. Every clinic website assumes that the client is a woman, and some are women-only spaces. He calls the location closest to his home. The person who answers the phone is polite, but almost immediately says that they need to speak to the client herself, and could she please come to the phone. Michael tries to explain that he is a trans man, that he needs an abortion. The person on the other end does not seem to understand. He needs to explain that he was assigned female at birth, that his provincial health card lists his sex as X, he identifies as a man, that he is pregnant and would like an appointment. The person gets angry, explains that they only serve women, and hangs up. He calls 3 more providers, and he eventually manages to book an appointment at a clinic 3 hours drive away in 10 days' time. But he's not confident in the care that he will receive. On the day of, they won't let his girlfriend into the clinic because her driver's license lists her sex as M and her name as Simon, and she doesn't look like her picture. They cite security concerns. Michael goes ahead alone and finds out that he is 25 weeks pregnant and therefore not eligible for abortion care in Canada. And so this is fictionalized, this is not a real person, this hasn't happened, but is nevertheless based on what we do know about trans people's access to contraceptive care, to knowledge about fertility and hormones, etc., etc. This is something that could happen, although it specifically has not happened to any one individual. So I'll present a case scenario like this to providers, and I'll ask them to help me identify the barriers and the solutions. So maybe you notice that there's issues here with branding and with websites. And so I often talk about a balance between gender neutral and gender inclusive language, and this is something that's come up in other sessions as well, that the exclusive use of the language of woman is the problem here, and that we need to balance recognizing that trans and non-binary people need abortion care and mentioning them explicitly, and then also using the language of pregnant people or anyone experiencing unwanted, unplanned pregnancy. There's issues here with booking. Many of the folks that I talk to have a policy of waiting for a woman's voice on the other end of the line and using that as a signal that they're talking to the client, which is, of course, problematic for all kinds of people. And so I train staff to ask, am I speaking to the person who this appointment is for, to anyone, regardless of the sound of the voice on the other end of the line. There's issues here with billing. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Canada and in elsewhere, the billing codes for insurance companies are sexed/gendered. So in British Columbia, Ontario, and elsewhere, if you don't have an F on your health card, the ministry will reject the claim for billing on the basis that only people with Fs are eligible for abortion services and other, quote, gendered healthcare services. One of the participants in my dissertation actually had the clinic call and say, your billing claim was rejected, you need to fix this, you need to get in touch with the ministry. So I train providers that they ought to be advocates for their trans clients and do that work themselves as opposed to placing the burden on trans people. There's issues over security here where this participant's or this fictionalized person's girlfriend is denied access on the basis of inconsistent or lack of matching identity documents. So I recommend that folks share identity-based security protocols over the phone during those intake sessions, being aware that these create barriers for all kinds of people, not just trans folks. And then in general, I train everybody, regardless of which fictionalized case scenario I'm putting in front of them, that they ought to never turn trans people away. That of course abortion is time sensitive. Many trans folks are not able to access trans-inclusive sex education or contraceptive care, and may not have health providers who are able to equip them with the knowledge that they need to make informed decisions about their fertility in light of their use of hormones, for example. And finally, that we ought to anticipate that trans people are needing services and plan accordingly, so that trans people are not made to be the guinea pig, the problem, the educator, all the kinds of narratives we've been hearing a lot about at this conference. Beyond that, I also advocate for and do activism around expanding abortion services. So beyond just talking about the current freestanding clinic and hospital system, what would it look like for trans people if we expanded the list of authorized providers, if family physicians, midwives, doulas, and nurses, etc., were able to deliver abortion care to people? What would that look like? That would help not only trans people, but all kinds of others who are marginalized within the way that we currently deliver abortion care. Second, what would it look like for trans people if we expanded the availability of and altered perceptions of self-managed and self-induced abortion options? This would involve a deprofessionalization, a demedicalization, even a decolonization of abortion as it's currently delivered. Oh, this one has the text. That's good. So what are my conclusions? What are my takeaways from 12 years of doing this work? First is that the barriers for trans-inclusive abortion care are plentiful and intersectional. So in the same way that abortion for cisgender folks is restricted, trans people are also living in rural communities, are also racialized, are also poor and street entrenched, and as a result have intersecting barriers to abortion care, even within a system where abortion is legal. It's easier for me, and has been easier for me, to help train providers on how to overcome the informational and institutional erasure of trans people. I can give you knowledge, I can train you about how to do better, we can change your policies and practices, but it's these political and philosophical objections to trans inclusion that are much more challenging to address. In the Canadian context, despite the obvious limitations with human rights laws, we recently passed something called Bill C-16, which added gender identity and expression to human rights legislation within the country, and I've been able to leverage that to inform abortion providers that trans inclusion is simply not optional, that they don't have the choice to be trans inclusive, that they have a legal obligation to do so. And finally, I am more committed to this work than ever. I'm convinced that it is making a difference, that it is important, and just a note on this conference, this work is also incredibly isolating, and it's going to make me cry, but I'm fine. It has been lovely in the company of being in the company of people who get it. So, thank you.